Hey everybody, welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to go over 3 common exercises in the joint range of motion you need to perform them effectively. If you stay to the end, you'll also learn how to self-assess your joints to pick for better exercises on your own. Okay, so before we begin, let's introduce a concept called prerequisites. And this is from the FRS, or the Functional Range Systems, and it's a really useful concept when it comes to understanding exercise selection and what could be appropriate for an individual. So the basic premise is that any activity that you want to do, whether it's running or squatting or deadlifting or playing basketball, any kind of global multi-joint pattern, within that pattern there are required ranges of motion for each joint in order to do that safely and effectively. And if you don't have those ranges of motion, then you could be potentially loading that pattern in an improper way, or you could also eventually be getting injured as well. Remember, mobility for us is our ability to distribute force. So it's not just a range of motion, but it should be considered the strength in your ranges of motion. That's why we're very big on learning mobility and teaching that, because you're basically teaching body control. So we always want to keep this in mind. We want to adapt the exercise to the individual, not adapt the individual to the exercise. So let's apply this concept with 3 different exercises that we have picked.
So our first exercise today is going to be the overhead press. As you can see, I'm doing it with a kettlebell, but it's also practiced with a barbell, a dumbbell, heavy rocks, anything. It's just getting the weight overhead. The big prerequisite range of motion that we're going to focus on today is called shoulder flexion. This is simply putting your arm overhead. In fact, we have a test for this as well. I'm going to irradiate tension in my body, stay tight, and simply try to move my arm in a straight line over my head without bending my elbow, without hyperextending through my back or moving my neck. When you do this, the shoulder is the only thing that should move. And when you get into a resistance point, stop. That's probably going to be your end range of active shoulder flexion. So now you know where that is. So here I'm doing an example of what I see when people don't have enough shoulder flexion and they still attempt to overhead press. They'll dump a lot of that energy into their lower back, their elbow will start to bend, their neck will start to go forward, and they're just pretty much taking that load that should be primarily in the shoulder, and it's being expressed in other parts because the shoulder can't go in that range of motion. Now, why they have a lack of shoulder flexion, we'll address that in other videos, but today we want to keep you training pain-free and make sure that you're still able to progress in a smart way. So don't stop training, just switch this out for something like an incline press. In the incline press, this is where I'm on a bench and I'm pressing at an angle, but I'm also within my capabilities of shoulder flexion. So whatever your range of motion is in your shoulder flexion test, that's where you want to apply the incline press. So you want to stay within that range of motion. Over time, work on your shoulder mobility and overhead capacity so that you can work back into doing military presses without pain and without restriction. This is an example of a full shoulder car. What we love about cars is that you can actually self-assess the ranges of motion that your shoulder has, but just keep in mind that you can start to assess yourself to make sure that you're picking the right exercises for what your goals are, but more importantly, for what your body can do in the current moment. All right, and our second exercise today is going to be push-ups. For this example, we'll be doing push-ups on the ground. There are thousands of other variations, and they all have their own individual requirements depending on what you're doing. But for push-ups on the ground, the big thing we're focusing on is wrist extension. Now, wrist extension is your ability to pull your fingers back towards your body. This is an actual test you can do. Keep your elbows straight, and then simply try to pull your fingers back towards your forearm as far as you can. That's going to be your active wrist extension. And ideally, you have almost, or at least the amount that is required in the push-ups, generally about 90 degrees. People don't have that. Well, oftentimes they'll feel a real pinching pain in the back of their wrist when doing push-ups. They may also find that when they're going through push-ups, they're actually not going through a full range of motion. They're using more of their back. They're leaning forward. Whether consciously or subconsciously, they're trying to get around that restriction in the wrist. And that's a huge problem because we don't want to put unnecessary damage on our wrist while we're trying to train our upper body. So some alternatives that we have are doing push-ups on parallettes, and this will give you a little bit more range of motion to play with that doesn't require complete wrist extension. And here we have the wrist car, and just like the shoulder car, we're expressing our full range of motion through the wrist, flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, and you can see pretty clearly whether or not you're going to have a lot of success in activities that require wrist extension or wrist flexion just by going through your wrist car. Here we have exercise number 3, split squats. Split squats are a great exercise for building leg strength. They're very friendly for people that don't have a ton of mobility. They're a great alternative to bilateral squats. However, in this variation that is very common, one of the big prerequisites is toe extension of the back leg. And this is where the big toe simply has the ability to extend. And how much it needs to extend is based off of how much range of motion you're going to be using it in the split squat. When you don't have that big toe extension, I've seen a lot of clients that will actually get pinches in front of their toes. They'll also start to have an unstable stance because they just can't get their weight shifted forward enough to be able to feel balanced. The back foot will start to cave out because it's trying to get around that mobility restriction, and this just results in suboptimal movement and usually pain in the foot. So a couple alternatives we have for that are taking the back foot and putting it on a slant board. The slant board actually acts as like a mini wedge and gives the person a little bit more toe extension to play with, just like if you were to raise the heel in a squat. It also allows them to focus more on loading that front leg because they don't have that back leg that's off balance or in pain. Another alternative is to take the back foot and put it on something that slides like a valve slide. And what this does is it takes the toe completely out of the equation and allows the person to still have 2 points of contact and train in a good range of motion so they can still build the strength they want in their legs. And as you can see, we've also showed toe extension in our toe cars that we use as part of our daily mobility routine.
Every pattern that we do has its own prerequisite range of motion. The cool thing about cars is for every joint, you're essentially taking your joint through its fullest range of motion in every single dimension that it can go into. So it becomes a way for you to train and also assess the readiness of that joint. So once you understand those cars, you need to put them into a routine because it's not enough to just do something once, right? The value is the compounding efforts of practicing them every day. So that's why we've also created a daily mobility routine. It's going to be somewhere on the screen. Check it out. And as always, stay moving and grooving.